Welcome back to Strange Form. Today, we're going to be looking at Big Bad Toy Store and Fresh Monkey Fiction's Operation Monster Force, a Big Bad Toy Store exclusive line that has been making ripples in the industry over the last year. Now today we're only going to be looking at one figure, and as many of you may have noticed, I'm missing two figures, which is Van Helsing and the red version of this figure. But why does this connect to our last video, which was the Roboskull, a throwback to the early 1980s Action Force line? Not to be confused again with Bobby Vala's Action Force line, but we'll get into that in a second. As with all things, all roads lead back to G.I. Joe. But how does this connect to G.I. Joe and Star Wars? Well, originally, the Action Man, the European counterpart to the 12-inch G.I. Joe figure, was starting to wane in popularity in the early 80s. The Star Wars line, in Europe, also under the Palitoy's license, was a game changer, with 3 3/4 figures and large vehicles, and this is what kids wanted at the time, the large vehicle playsets being one of the biggest selling points for the Star Wars line. And both Hasbro and Palitoy's came to the conclusion that they needed to shrink down the 12-inch G.I. Joe figure to something more manageable. But initially, they did it in very different ways. The first line of Palitoy's Action Force figures were actually just small versions of the most popular Action Man figures, but in a more static 5-point articulation Star Wars figure format. So the legs moved at the hips, and the arms swiveled, and the head turned around, and that was it. Where Hasbro and G.I. Joe wanted to create something much more posable, but at a point in the future, these two lines would merge. However, initially after their first release of shrunk-down Action Man figures, Palitoy started to create a storyline around this series. And that storyline involved characters like Baron Ironblood and the Red Shadows, and this is where our story converges with the Monster Force line and Fresh Monkey Fiction, as well as Bobby Vala's Action Force and the current G.I. Joe line, really, which is quite fascinating as all of these lines are both competing and working in a sort of synergistic fashion to recreate a lot of what came out in the Action Force line, but through very obscure means. And this is why we're going to talk about this one today, as this is very much a recreation of an Action Force figure, and Fresh Monkey Fiction is doing this across quite a few different figures being released later this year, releasing obvious Action Force designs under different names. But this means we have to talk about what happened with Action Force, and that leads us to Bobby Vala and his creation. And this actually has nothing to do with any of the Action Force figures from the original storyline. However, his original packaging did actually lift a lot of design cues from the Palitoy's release. Vala, who used to work for Hasbro, found himself venturing out on his own and decided to create a Kickstarter in order to launch a brand new line. And he saw the opportunity to do the funniest thing ever, and that was to buy the license to the name Action Force, thus barring Hasbro from releasing anything Action Force, or any other upstarts from using the name. But he decided not to relaunch the Action Force series in favor of something brand new, and this led to companies like Fresh Monkey Fiction and Skeletron to attempt to re-release these figures while tiptoeing through a minefield of rights acquisitions. So you have the Baron Ironblood, but not Baron Ironblood, as well as many other figures from the initial line. As time went along, Palitoy's decided to drop the limited articulation of the original Action Force line in favor of releasing G.I. Joe Real American Hero figures in the European market, though altered, sometimes different color schemes, and other times just different file cards. But they didn't just drop the original Action Force storyline. As a matter of fact, they turned Baron Ironblood into Cobra Commander. So this led to a really interesting mixture of themes and reimagining of characters and storylines. And now it's a very interesting time to be an Action Force collector, as you have an Action Force in name, and then an Action Force without the name covertly being released under different properties. Now, like I said before, I'm missing two in this line, and I've been waiting for them since Christmas from Big Bad Toy Store. And this brings me to another subject, and that's the fact that Big Bad Toy Store is going to have a bit of a hard time being the only purveyors of this line if it gets really popular, because the only two places that you can pick these up are right now at Big Bad Toy Store or on eBay, and the scalper prices of these have skyrocketed. With many of these selling out and Big Bad Toy Store not getting them back in very quickly, with them limiting the market this way, I can foresee this line actually having some issues in the future. And also, it would appear that many of them have gone up in price by about $2 over the last couple of months. And so these are all now around $40, and then the large figures are almost $100, which is quite a bit considering the rest of the market is hovering between $25 and $35. So these are amongst the more expensive figures right now, which in a minute we'll get into quality paint applications and look at how well they stand up against standard G.I. Joe classified figures, as well as Action Force. But it gets even stranger when you look into Fresh Monkey Fiction's earlier lines, such as the Eagle Force figures, a re-release of the doomed 1980s 2-inch figures from the Rhode Island Mego Company. I say doomed because they only got one run out, and that was a miserable failure, unfortunately, largely because of the big companies that they were competing against at the time. One of those companies, Hasbro, appears to actually have stolen a few of the figure designs from them. Fresh Monkey Fiction decided to pick up that line, but create a 3 3/4 figure instead. Originally small gold die-cast figures, the initial release of the larger versions were based on that line, but then they started to spread out into other designs, and a lot of those were based on the Action Force series. So many of these figures have already seen the light of day in that format. Alright, first let's look at presentation. The package design is pretty slick. There's a figure photo on the front, and then we have the sort of book design that each one of them has, and the number of the figure. On the back, each one has the exact same write-up, and the rest of the wave. Top and bottom, and it's a window flap design. The one we're looking at today is the Sleepwalker Crimson Moon Division. Now, one interesting thing I did learn about this line is that Gridiron Studios does all of the weapons. So you're not just getting an interesting figure, you're getting several Gridiron's accessories, which themselves can set you back as much as one of these figures. The box is pretty thick cardboard, much thicker than most G.I. Joe classified figures. I think that's to give the allure of a finer item. Inside we have our figure, his hand and his weapons, 2 different head sculpts, but it's the third head sculpt that's the most interesting. There's a package full of his accessories, his backpack, a bunch of hoses, and inside we have this head, effectively turning him into a Crimson Shadows figure from the Action Force line. So the really interesting thing about these is they serve so many purposes. Effectively, they've given you 3 possible figures out of just this one. And I think that's the idea. A lot of these are mix and match, so they've really taken army building to a new level. Now in hand, the joints feel fairly stiff, especially at the elbow. I don't know if they feel breakable, but they definitely feel more like Valor vs. Action Force line than G.I. Joe Classified. The figure also has quite a bit of heft. The paint scheme is okay, but not actually as impressive as I would like to see for a $40 figure. There's a significant amount of overpaint on some of the finer details, and the wash looks splotchy. So all told, there are around 43 items in the box, and a lot of tiny little connective pieces, as well as quite a few blast effects, a couple of weapons, some tubing, but how is all of this supposed to go together? And that was a question that I had, is there's no instructions. But that brings me to the philosophy of design for all of the accessories and pretty much the figure itself. Over on Instagram, I was postulating this, and DMazing used the word modular. And that's exactly it. The accessories are modular. So are the figures. In fact, this figure is exactly the same as this one, but this one being in black. Identical in every way, down to the accessories. And this one as well, except for this one has a different rifle. Other than that, these are all exactly the same. And the same is true of this one and the red version of this one. Those are also pretty much the exact same figure. So really in this line, sculpt-wise, only 6 of the 9 figures are unique. But again, that leads me to their philosophy of design, which appears to be bent towards army building. As with all of these different parts, this figure can become several different figures. All the ports are pretty much the same size, so the display possibilities are vast. And I hope knowing this philosophy of design will help you in choosing whether you want to collect the entire line or just get the one with the color scheme you like best. And what all do we have here that's modular? Well, we have a series of different air filtration canisters that can be put either on this gas mask or the one he's got here. The tubes can plug into the gas mask as well, so you don't have to only have the air filtration canister, but you can have these little L bends, or even an extension and this large canister on one side, or this one here. These also fit all of the pegs on the backpack, of which there are many. So you can have the tubes coming out any way that you want, and you have an extensioner here as well for the tubes. So really, you can build him out any way you think is aesthetically pleasing. As for the guns, they are very steampunk, and this entire line screams Wolfenstein, as you have evil steampunk Nazis, as well as vampires, mummies, and all manner of horror icons. And that brings me to their philosophy of storytelling, which is to take well-known tropes and give a new spin on them. As for the story these are based on, well, all I've seen so far is a free comic book on Big Bad Toy Store, and each one of these comes with a single comic page, but so far there isn't much to speak of when it comes to a huge superseding story. So what all is in here? Well, 2 weapons, 2 pegs, 2 connectors, 2 L-bend connectors, 4 sets of filters for the gas masks, 5 red clear plastic blast effects, 3 different heads, one of which seems to be so you can turn the character into the aforementioned Action Force figure, i.e. the Red Vulture. You have a theme stand that has his name on the front, a backpack, 6 sets of tubes in small, medium, and large, 3 extra sets of hands in open palm, closed fist, and trigger finger. The ones installed are the gripping hands. And then you have little odds and ends such as pegs, connectors, and these 3 pieces that can be used as anything from the gas mask to capping off holes. So it really all goes together however you want. Oh, and I forgot to mention, he also has a little armband, as well as a clear smoke effect. As for articulation, we have some of the most easily removed hands that I've seen on a figure of this size. They don't have that heavy snapping that feels like they're going to break, and the hinge on them is actually pretty smooth, so kudos to Fresh Monkey Fiction for this. We have a swivel at the bicep, and a hinge and rotate at the shoulder, as well as butterfly joints at the upper shoulder and clavicle. We have a dual stage elbow, a dual stage neck, a ball joint at the waist, a swivel at the upper thigh, as well as dog bone joints at the crotch, a 2-stage knee, a swivel at the calf, and then a hinge swivel at the ankle. So overall, not terrible articulation. It's about 1/12 scale standard. Alright, as we enter the pose gallery, let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. If these guys had shoelaces, they would definitely be tied in little Nazis. Though the storyline is a little bit convoluted, it revolves around an ancient Egyptian mummy who was so evil that his name was scrubbed from history, who awakens in the modern era to create an army of the undead, both using his power to reanimate corpses, and Dr. Caligari, a Nazi mad scientist who is a brain in a jar with a mechanical body. Only the unlikely team of Declan Van Helsing and Dracula have a chance at stopping the Forgotten King's quest for world domination. There are definitely elements of Hellboy, Wolfenstein, Blood Rain, Frankenstein's Army, Overlord, and Dead Snow sewn throughout this narrative and design style. And this makes sense, as Nazi mad scientists have been a tried and true trope throughout the horror sphere for decades, and elements of their aesthetic have made it into everything from Star Wars to G.I. Joe. On a side note, I find it kind of hilarious that Hasbro has no problem with the Cobra characters wearing those helmets, but draws the line at a handkerchief over the head. Now I'm glad that Fresh Monkey Fiction had the guts to release such controversial villain designs in such an overly sensitive time. After all, evil that has an alluring aesthetic is the most dangerous kind, as it undermines our assumption that it will be ugly and easily identified. The write-up on the back of the box reads, "Once a sorcerer pharaoh whose reign was so vile his name was erased from Egyptian history, the Forgotten King pursues a sinister agenda, gathering mystical artifacts from around the world for some unknown purpose. Every soldier sent to stop him is killed and reanimated into an undead zombie that is under the Forgotten King's command. Worried that the Forgotten King's reign of terror will not be able to be stopped, the military enlists the help of monster hunter Declan Van Helsing. Seeing no other option, Declan goes against the Van Helsing family's wishes and opens Tomb 13, freeing the world's most powerful vampire, Count Dracula. His rationale? It may take a monster to bring down a monster." And so Operation Monster Force is formed. Under Dracula's direction, a unique vampire strike unit is created called Delta Red, whose undead condition makes them immune to the Forgotten King's powers. It's a race against time for Dracula and Van Helsing to discover the Forgotten King's hidden lair and destroy him before his mysterious plan reaches completion. Now, I think that there's a misprint on the back of the box because it says the world's more powerful vampire rather than most, but I corrected it for effect. The inside flap comic reads, "The Sleepwalker is the designation we've given to Dr. Caligari's personal army. Every soldier wears a helmet and mask that continuously feeds a type of sleeping gas designed by Caligari. He calls it Zeiss Agent, and those who breathe it slip into a somnambulatory state, a perpetual nightmare that causes the sleepwalkers to fight whomever Caligari suggests. The Zeiss gas affects the electrical impulse of the brain, and as such, the powers of the electrical beam weapons the sleepwalkers carry. The result is an army of nightmare soldiers who obey Dr. Caligari without question and fight to the last man. What's worse is Dr. Caligari has assigned his sleepwalkers to protect the Forgotten King. For what mad reason he does so, we have yet to uncover. So these definitely have an interesting jumping off point when it comes to storytelling. In the future, it looks like we're getting everything from the Invisible Man to Frankenstein and every zombie in between. But how do these stack up to the heaviest 1/12 scale military hitters on the scene, G.I. Joe Classified and Action Force? To measure them, I gave them all the same base and leg spread. Size-wise, Monster Force fits squarely between Classified and Action Force, ever so slightly smaller than the more chunky Valiverse offerings, but slightly larger than the average Classified figure. Articulation-wise, he's almost identical to both aforementioned lines, but is definitely a thicker plastic than the Joes. And of course, coming from Gridiron Studios, the weapons have no gumminess at all. However, the difference in size between all of these is minute, in that it's barely even worth mentioning as they all mingle fairly well, and the Joes have definitely fought stranger villains, but this might be a first for the Civil War embroiled Action Force guys. Now, one thing I did find strange about this line, with so many upcoming pre-orders, there's not one female character in the entire Monster Force line thus far, so these guys being German might make perfect sense as it's going to be a massive sausage fest. Alright, now as we come to a close, here are some of my thoughts regarding this. I think that the figure overall is an excellent figure, and I'd really like to see where this line goes. One of the issues that a lot of people online have had, and I think this is valid, is that this company has far more pre-orders than they do toys on the shelves. And the toys that they have released have been sort of sporadic in that they've been in and out of stock, and the reason for this is that the only purveyor of this item is of course Big Bad Toy Store. And so there's no other place that you can get these, and I don't think that they are ordering anywhere near the quantities that the market is currently demanding. And the problem with this is I can see this causing a lot of collectors to dip out or lose interest, as these are going to be very difficult to procure as time goes along. And my only other major complaint is that the paint applications are a little bit sloppy in that Classified and Valiverse are kind of running circles around them when it comes to clean paint applications. These have a little more of a home modeler's look, and I think that when you're charging upwards of $40 per figure, you actually need to step up your game a little bit. And I mean things like the white outlines have a bit of overpaint, especially on closer inspection. Now, at distance this looks fine, but it's a small enough figure that justifies fine detailing on close inspection. And there's a lot of sort of slapdash paint applications. Like, all around him they've decided to sort of muddy up the red by just basically blotching on sort of a brown. And so it has brown blotches all over it. And I think basically just a static red would have looked better. So it's one of those figures that looks awesome at distance, but on close inspection you see the flaws. The articulation is pretty good, and I really like the modular design, the ability to sort of make up your own story as to where the tubes and hoses all go. And of course the weaponry being made by Gridiron Studios is a nice touch, so design-wise it's a really nice figure, and the whole line seems to be. But also, some might have complaints regarding the fact that these are largely the same figure just repainted. So collecting the entire line is collecting the same figure over and over with just slight differences. And for me, the jury's still out as to whether this is a cash grab or actually a really good way to get people to army build. One thing I will say in the company's defense is that this is the first wave. The beginning of most toy lines are a little rough around the edges, and even though Fresh Monkey Fiction has been doing quite a bit before this one, this really is their first mass-produced item. So this line is bound to have a little kinks at first, and it's my hope that some of the paint applications get better over successive releases, especially at $40. But overall this thing ticks a lot of boxes, especially the fact that it's both military and monster, which is what attracted me to it in the first place. As for the rest of the line, we'll start getting to those in the next episode. But as for now, as always, remember, never stop collecting.